Hello, Chicago Plants following, and thank you for joining us for our DIY plant care tips and tricks. We're going to be going over a few things today just related to kind of nice at-home ways to do plant care in inexpensive forms. There are so many different ways that people, will spend money on certain plant care corrections and whatnot. And today's video is really all about like simple at-home remedies, tips, tricks, things that you can be doing really inexpensively at home with stuff that you probably already have around your house. So we will slowly just wait for people to trickle in for a little bit. As always, feel free to be posting questions and whatnot, and I'll try and answer as many as I can throughout. But we'll go over a few like demonstrative things related to the different tips and tricks we'll be doing today. So if you have any specific questions on the things that we'll be doing, feel free to put that out there. Otherwise, we'll just make sure that everybody gets addressed. So to kind of give a brief overview of the things we'll be talking about, for starters, I want to address some alternative fertilizer methods. We do carry earth medicine fertilizer in store, which kind of goes hand in hand with things I'll be talking about today, because we typically advise for folks not to use chemical-based fertilizers. So we'll kind of get into that a little bit. Talk about some watering alternatives. A lot of people know that we talk about our Calathias and Dracaenas and certain varieties that prefer like a filtered or distilled water. Not all of us have, that filtered tap on the refrigerator, and distilled water can get expensive if you're always going out to buy that. So we'll go over a few ways to kind of more inexpensively water your plants with that high quality water. We'll talk about a few kind of pest remedies. I saw somebody already asked about neem oil. Yeah, Aaron, we'll actually address that specifically regarding fungus gnats, and then kind of pulling in how neem oil is also a factor. And then I see that you tried cinnamon as well. So we'll definitely talk about those kind of things, because as much as like the kind of store pest remedies like a neem oil are good in certain situations, they're not always good for all pest related issues you might have. And then the last thing we'll talk about are kind of soil considerations regarding one, how to make your own soil at home. And then two, how to make sure that the soil you have is good for your plants, and to kind of do that in a way that's going to be inexpensive. So you're not going out of your way to spend a lot of money on like a succulent soil, because some of those bags can be really expensive and you don't get that much soil out of them. So we will start at the top regarding some of those different fertilizer at home tips and tricks that you can do. So at the end of the day, when you're thinking about fertilizer, you have your nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus as kind of the three main chemicals that are going to be important for your plants. And so generally speaking, if you're going to get a chemical fertilizer at a store, it's going to be really high in nitrogen. Phosphorus and potassium will kind of vary. And oftentimes, if you're trying to get a certain plant to bloom, for example, and you're giving it a little more fertilizer, a lot of the chemical-based stuff high in nitrogen is going to give what's called nutrient burn to your plants. And this is where you're going to notice browning kind of coming out at the tips of the leaves. And it looks a lot different than the browning and the yellowing that you get from overwatering. It, quite literally looks less natural. And so one great way to avoid nutrient burn from hurting your plants is just kind of going with one of these more natural, less chemically based fertilizer alternatives. So the first one we'll talk about are eggshells. And we have right here just a couple of day-old eggshells here, and you can take these either from an egg you cracked to make. If you boiled eggs and you kind of take the shell off slowly, once you have your eggs, these are going to be very, very high in calcium, which when you think of calcium, you think strong bones. It kind of works in a similar fashion regarding plants, except it's helping them kind of expand the cells of their root bodies. So a lot of times calcium is an important nutrient to ensure that your plants have healthy roots, that they expand into a new pot. And it's not always a nutrient that's going to be found in a lot of those popular store brand fertilizers that I mentioned. So it's as simple when you have your eggshells as just crushing them up, and you can use a little dish. It does help if they're a little bit older. So if you have like a compost pile, that's going to make things easier to kind of work with drier, less dense eggs. But once you have your cracked egg mixture, as you can imagine, you're going to want to get this into your plant. So right here, my lovely assistant, the Calathea ornata, is sitting here waiting for some nice calcium boost. And so you're just going to layer on some of those eggshells onto the top of the soil, and if you can distribute them well, that'll be best. But this isn't like a matter of kind of shoving them into the soil, it's just layering it up on the top. So when you go to water it, you're going to have all that nice calcium and the nutrients kind of seeping into the soil with that plant. So the eggshells are a really great thing if you're just looking for something cheap at home. If you have a plant that's sort of struggling and you can't identify why, unlike a chemical fertilizer, which can do harm if used improperly, you can't really do harm with the eggshells. Worst case scenario, it's just not going to do anything for your plants, but you may notice just a little boost in their health, something that you were kind of struggling to get them to look a little bit better. Eggshells are a good thing to try. And another really good method, kind of along the same lines as the eggshells, using just day-old ingredients that you have around. Coffee grounds make for a really good boost in nitrogen, which, as I mentioned, is found in those chemical fertilizers, but getting it derived from the likes of coffee grounds is going to be a little bit easier on the plants. And again, you have coffee grounds around, so after you make your French press or you pour over, just go ahead, take those grounds from whatever you're using to make your coffee. Generally, let them sit for a little bit. It can be a little more acidic beginning right after you actually make the coffee. So if you can give it a day, have those grounds just sitting, and then go ahead and use them. And same as I mentioned with the eggs, just kind of sprinkling it around the top of the soil. That's all you need to do. Go ahead and water your plants, and you'll notice over the next couple weeks as you water, it'll slowly just decompose, seep into the soil, and your plant's going to be able to reap all the nutrients from the plant or from the eggshells or coffee grounds. So those are the two biggest kind of fertilizer DIY tricks that I like to use. Folks will also do things with bananas being high in potassium, specifically using the peels. This isn't necessarily the easiest thing to do, especially if you have just like a 4-inch plant like this. But if you do have something larger, in a 10, 12, 14-inch pot that you can actually put a banana peel into, same methodology of just letting it sit in the top of the soil as you water. You'll get similar effects, but again, potassium isn't necessarily going to be as important for plant health as, say, nitrogen is, specifically for just general use fertilizer purposes. But as I mentioned, we do have earth medicine in store, and the earth medicine, it's very similar to kind of what I'm doing here in that it is completely fungal and like a compost. So you're not going to have any of the chemical burn concerns. It's kind of the closest thing you can get to a fertilizer in a bottle that's also coming from these organic nutrients. So the next big consideration for kind of general soil health and whatnot is going to be the water that you water your plants with. And as I mentioned, we usually recommend filtered or distilled if you're going to be watering calatheas or dracaenas. The plants that typically are going to be more stressed out from hard tap water. So there's really a couple of things you can do when it comes to cheap alternatives to going out and buying distilled water every time. And the number one thing, which we mentioned on prior streams, which we tell everybody in store, is just letting your water sit out overnight before you use it. This is going to make sure that a lot of those hard chemicals, specifically chlorine that's in the tap water, evaporate out, and they're not as prevalent by the time you get around to that water to use it the next day. So that's a good way to make sure if you do have sensitive plants, they're getting water that's not going to be as heavily contaminated with those different tap water ingredients. So alternatively, if you're not looking to have your water sit out overnight, there are two really good methods that you can turn to, and the number one is going to be rainwater. As you're probably aware, today in Chicago, it's raining all day, and it's as simple as having a bucket outside that can collect that water. Alternatively, here at the store, we did get a rain collector through the city. In some districts, I believe you can get them for free. If not, I think we got ours for like $20 here. And it's really just kind of a garbage receptacle, but built into it will be a spigot at the bottom for you to actually get the water out once it's full. And then the top of the barrel will have a collector reserve, which has a screen over the top so you don't have to worry about animals or different debris falling into it. But it's a really good receptacle to collect that rainwater and kind of give you the best possible water for your plants, better than filtered or distilled, because there's a lot of natural nutrients that if plants were living outside, they would be getting as just the rain comes down. And you're not necessarily going to find that from these other more purified versions of water that you're going to be looking for. So the rainwater, it's free, it rains all the time, you might as well use it. It's more so just that it's not going to probably cover all of your watering needs, especially during the summer if it's not raining as often. Rain collection can take a little while to get started, so unless you set it out kind of months ahead of when you're going to be needing the water, it will take some time to get to the point that you can be using it. So one great alternative to the rainwater is another just cheap at home. You have it around anytime you boil water, whether it's to make hard-boiled eggs, if you're boiling potatoes or vegetables, you have that excess water. Even pasta, for example, where you have the water that you've already used to cook the food and you have it just sitting there, you're probably going to dump it out. Save that water, let it sit out, and obviously let it cool. You should not be watering your plants with any boiling water. But once it gets to the point that the water is cooled, that works as a great substitution for either a filtered or distilled water. It's almost doing the same thing as if you were to filter water, in the sense that by boiling it, you're getting rid of all those contaminants that are found in tap water. But at the same time, if let's say you did use that water to boil eggs, as I mentioned, eggshells are really high in calcium. A lot of that leaches out into the water when you're boiling them. So now it's kind of a two-in-one. You get a good purified water source to water your plants with, but it's also going to be a little higher in the calcium that is leached out of those eggs. So really good option. Stop dumping out that excess water. You can use it, and maybe just like save a vase or some kind of a receptacle at home that you can pour that into after it's cooled, and then you always just have it instead of being reliant on the next time you're going to be cooking using boiled water. So yeah, just to recap, so far we've talked about kind of the fertilizer concerns regarding the use of eggshells and coffee grounds, water alternatives using rainwater or a boiled water instead of filtered or distilled. The next things we're going to talk about are related to pests. And as Aaron asked earlier about fungus gnats and neem oil, Aaron very aptly pointed out that she did not have success in kind of mitigating the fungus gnats with neem oil. And that's because neem oil is not going to be effective against the likes of fungus gnats. Neem oil is typically going to be more useful towards spider mites, aphids, or mealybugs. It really is not going to do anything for fungus gnats, as they're a bit of a different breed when it comes to houseplant pests. So right at the top, I'll say, typically speaking, fungus gnats are not going to be destructive to your plants the way aphids, mealybugs, or spider mites will, all of which those aforementioned leach from nutrients from the plants. Fungus gnats are an annoyance to us, but typically they're not going to actually cause harm to the plants. But that being said, they're still annoying and we don't want them around, and most over-the-counter remedies and solutions you'll find at stores just are not going to treat them. And then if you go out and you buy the sticky traps that you can put in there, those might be okay at collecting fungus gnats, and you'll notice if you have a bad problem that the sticky trap fills up quickly. The problem is most of the time fungus gnats have already burrowed into the soil. They might be living there, they might be laying eggs there. So really the only way that you can combat fungus gnats once you have a problem is literally from the root of it. And so the best remedy I have found to take care of fungus gnats is by using sand. And so, as I mentioned, those fungus gnats are going to try and live in the soil, both for a place to put their eggs and for them to live. So by taking your plant, let's assume right here that this guy has fungus gnats. He doesn't, thankfully, but as though he did, we have our bag of sand here. By layering on sand on top of your soil, and just enough that it's to cover the top, it doesn't have to really seep in, what you're doing here is slowly creating something that will suffocate the fungus gnats and not allow them to get out and continue to get the nutrients from the plant that they need, or going out for water, whatever that might be. They're able to kind of get suffocated and stuck into this sandy trap that you've created for yourself. And so right here you can see it's really not a thick layer of sand. It's just enough to cover the top of the soil. All you need to do now is weigh it. And once you have the sand over the top, you're going to notice slowly that fewer fungus gnats are coming out and able to breed, able to start laying new eggs in the soil. This is going to be the best way to kind of strike them at where they start, instead of just getting rid of the ones you already see flying around. And if you do have a big problem, it's always good to use the sand coverage in addition to the likes of a sticky trap, just to make sure that the ones that are flying around don't decide, hey, we can't make our home in this plant anymore, let's find a new one. But if you can figure out which plant is the biggest problem for the fungus gnats, that's the one to start with sand. And the sand does not cause any harm being on the plant like that. In fact, it's really helpful depending on the varieties, just kind of adding a layer of aeration and kind of drainage to the plant depending on the soil you've used. So really good, inexpensive way to deal with fungus gnats, better than a lot of the over-the-counter things you'll find. And the other thing I'll say regarding sand, do not go on Amazon or any other online retailer and buy sand that's made for houseplants. All sand is created equally. If you live somewhere where you can just go onto the beach and pull some sand, you can totally do that. But if not, you can go to any hardware store, a Lowe's, and get the sand that you would use for like a play sand set, or even a sand that's used for construction. You're going to be able to get 20, 50-pound bags of that for a few dollars versus the $15, $20 you'll pay for a few ounces of houseplant sand. And effectively, it's the same thing. So don't be spending too much on sand. We have a lot of it. And it's really good for a lot of things. So as we are still talking about pests, let's talk about another good remedy for those that are dealing with fungus gnats but have mealybugs or spider mite problems. We hear all the time in the store that people who have these issues have tried neem oil, and neem oil is going to come with mixed reviews. Some people swear by it and have had good success. Others will say they've tried it on their problem and it just does not do anything. And it really is going to be one of those case-by-case situations where it depends on, one, how bad the pest problem is, two, whether or not your home is kind of encouraging those pests to be there. Because one consideration that a lot of people don't take into account is that we all have pests. All of our plants have a certain degree of pests that live in them, whether it's spider mites, aphids, mealybugs. All of these plants that we get are most of the time coming from Florida, and all of these growers are working with plants that have these pests as a day-to-day factor of the plant's well-being. It's just that until the situation and the environment in which the plant is living in can foster the health of these pests, they don't really necessarily see the problem. And so it's where a lot of people year-round will have no issues, and then all of a sudden winter comes along and they have spider mites. Well, the spider mites were already there in your plant. It's just that once it got dry, the humidity drops, now all of a sudden the spider mites are really excited to come out and start bothering the plant. So it's always kind of a misperception that people have that, oh, how did I get the pests? Well, you already had the pests. You just created a really good environment for those pests to thrive. So how do you combat them once you've created this situation for them? If you're not going to use a neem oil, which, like I said, it works some cases, sometimes it doesn't, the best solution that I have found at home is the use of Pine Sol, or conversely, really any organic soap is going to work super well, and mixing just a few drops of it into a spray bottle with water. This seems, like kind of a out of left field approach to taking care of fungus, or how to take care of mealybugs and spider mites, but you would be surprised how effectively Pine Sol or an organic dish soap works opposed to neem oil when you have a really bad problem. Neem oil doesn't always kill on the spot. It more so gives them less of a chance of survival. It can kind of suffocate them. It's more of a slow burn when it comes to taking care of your pest problem. Whereas the Pine Sol and the organic dish soap mixed in with the water is going to be more of a kill on the spot kind of solution. And the other thing that's good about Pine Sol, it does leave kind of a gleam on the plants, a certain like stickiness, almost a shine that they're not able to really attach onto as effectively. And in having that kind of barrier of defense on the plants, even if, let's say, not all the mealybugs were there present when you sprayed, they're going to have a much harder time kind of taking home on the leaves and the stems and all the areas that they like to leach nutrients from, because you've kind of created this protective shield on the plant. And so typically speaking, this is the kind of thing that you don't want to be using every day. It's more like a once a week application, kind of reassess the next week depending on how things are looking. But like I said, folks will have, told us about situations where they're using neem oil for months on end and it's just kind of slowly mitigating the problem but not necessarily taking care of it outright. The Pine Sol or the dish soap is going to be a lot more effective at kind of quickly taking care of your issue. Pretty little plant, yes. Pine Sol, it's a floor cleaner. And it works really well also just as a multi-surface cleaner. You can find this at literally any hardware store, pharmacy, Amazon, wherever you want to find it. Pine Sol can be found anywhere. So it's a really good solution if you don't want to go out of your way to find neem oil, because that's going to be carried a little less frequently. But yeah, like I said, also an organic dish soap kind of has the same effect in terms of killing on the spot, making sure that they don't have a good surface to connect onto. And like I said, these are certain pests that like to leach the nutrients out of the plant. So by creating a really inhospitable surface for them to be leaching those nutrients off of, it's just going to make sure that you don't deal with kind of the ongoing concern a few weeks down the road. So those are kind of the two main pest things. To recap, like I said, fungus gnats, best to just layer off some sand on the soil. Mealybug spider mites, go with a dish soap or Pine Sol mixed in with some water, and you really only need a few drops, so don't overdo it. But those are going to be kind of the two best things to deal with those guys. DIY style, stuff that you have at home. You're not going to have to spend money out at the store trying to deal with your pests. So while we're on the topic of sand and how you can incorporate that into your plants, as I mentioned before, depending on the soil that you need for your plants, specifically like a succulent or a cactus mix, it can be pricey when you're getting little bags of it from the store, when a lot of times you only need a little bit of it, and moreover, it's something that's not that far from what you already have with your normal potting soil. It's just that you want to create something that's a little bit more drainable, it has more aeration, it's not going to be holding on to moisture as effectively as just a standard potting soil might. So sand is a great thing to incorporate in with just a normal potting soil. So as you guys know, we work primarily with Fox Farm soil here in the store, and right now the ocean forest that we have is going to be a really good mixture just to use for all of your plants. Rather than going out and buying an entirely new soil for your succulents and cactus specifically, just go ahead with that Fox Farm, mix some sand into it. And a lot of times if you have some additional perlite, or we here at the store use pumice, which is a volcanic rock, really anything that's going to add kind of that rocky, better degree of drainage that you don't get typically out of a more loam or peat-based soil, that's all you need to make a quote-unquote like cactus or succulent mix, because ultimately that's kind of the only concern. It's just making the soil that is going to be good for all of your normal foliage plants a little more drainable, not as receptible to holding on to moisture as the soil would be without those kind of additions to it. So like I said, if you are looking for the sand, just go get the sand for a play box or for construction. It's going to be cheap, and just adding some of that into your soil is all you need to do to make a cactus or succulent mix. So last but not least here, this is the only one that doesn't really fall into another category of kind of DIY plant care. But folks are always talking about, especially when they have kind of neglected a plant, that it needs to be watered more thoroughly. Jackie, one of our store members here, had done a video a few weeks back about how to kind of know when your plant is fully watered. And a lot of times it can be hard once you've neglected a plant so severely to really water it again, because you're going to notice the soil on the top is rock hard. If you stick your finger in, sometimes you can't, but you'll notice the roots are rock hard. So we are going to take just a pair of chopsticks that you can get from your favorite sushi delivery joint. For me, it's Uni, right down North Ave here in Wicker Park. Go ahead and take those chopsticks, because you are going to just try your best to break up all of that soil that has now stuck and clumped together from the neglect that you've given your plant. Let's assume that this guy right here had issues regarding the aeration to him, and he's not getting the same ability to absorb the moisture from watering. You notice you water and it just goes right through. A lot of times the water is just not going to absorb when soil is so rock hard from enough neglect, enough underwatering. So by taking that chopstick and using it throughout the plant, aerating it like this is going to be a really effective way to make sure that when you do go to water that neglected plant, you don't have the water just running straight out. It's going to do a better job at reaching the roots and kind of getting around to all of the soil of the plant. This is the kind of thing you can really do even if you don't have an underwater neglected plant. Aerating the soil can be super effective, especially with larger plants that have a more important job of kind of expanding their roots into a new pot, for example. Aerating the soil is just a really good thing to do once a month, once every other month, to make sure that your plants can absorb moisture better, and the roots are able to expand more effectively than if the soil is all compact and rock hard. So the other use of the chopstick, which again, just wherever you get your sushi or other favorite cuisine that serves with chopsticks, using this as a prop for a plant that's tipping over is a really effective way at a short-term little kind of implement to keep your plant growing in the right direction. And this can be used kind of twofold. One is a prop. If your plant is leaning in a certain direction, using that chopstick to keep it upright is going to then encourage it to keep growing in that direction. But alternatively, if you have the likes of, a pothos or a small philodendron that you want to kind of get ready to trellis or climb on something, a chopstick is a really good kind of training wheel for the plant to start out on. Kind of gives it some support that it can start latching onto, and then if you're going to graduate that up to a trellis, or a lot of folks like to use hooks that you can put on the wall, it's just going to kind of send it in the right direction to allow your plant to climb, trail, kind of do the trellis thing, if that is your ultimate goal for that plant. And again, just as simple as using some chopsticks that you have at home. You can always go out and get the bamboo stakes, but you don't always find those everywhere. They're kind of in short supply right now, and most people have chopsticks around at home. So really good, simple method to kind of work as not only a prop up for those leaning plants, but also for the trailing, climbing plants. Give them something to start latching onto when they're young. It's a lot easier with a young plant to kind of send it up to do a trellis kind of a situation than it is with a more mature plant that's already just hanging all over the place. Those will be a little bit more work to eventually kind of graduate to a climbing setting. So that is all I have today as far as DIY tricks go. Just to give a recap of everything we discussed when it comes to fertilizer, you can use those eggshells for both calcium as well as kind of better root structure. The coffee grounds, which are higher in nitrogen, are going to be a really good way to kind of supplement if you're not using a fertilizer in a plant that's more susceptible to root or nutrient burn problems. Opposed to watering with the distilled or filtered water, using your rainwater or just day-old boiled water is going to be really nice, and depending on what you used it to boil, it's going to be higher in nutrients as well. For the pest concerns, sand is what you want to tackle those fungus gnats. For the mealybugs and spider mites, a pine sol or dish soap solution is going to be oftentimes more effective than a neem oil. And then last but not least, using those chopsticks in various different ways for your plants, aeration, propping up, they're all going to be effective tools to kind of implement rather than going out to get bamboo stakes or whatever other tools you're going to see at a hardware store. So that's all I have. Not too many questions today, but like I said, if you guys do have any other thoughts regarding DIY tricks, if there are things you do that you'd like to let us know, feel free to post after we put this video up. And if you have any questions regarding these tricks that we put out there, let us know, and we can always do some follow-up Q&A if people have their own concerns or have tried the things that we've said and they haven't worked for them. So feel free to reach out. We're always here. And thank you guys so much for tuning in today. We'll see you next time.